again. We saw top episode 1 tonight, of course. We had 32 fighters, which is the big twist, is you have to fight your way on the show. Couple of familiar names, Steve Burns, CB Dalloway, fought today. For some reason, I get the feeling I've heard of Cale Yarborough, but he hadn't had a fight, so I really don't know about that. Mike Dolce and Dante Rivera, I know from IFL, of course. It was nice to see them qualify. Some of the old IFLers. Alright, first up, we had the whole 32. They had to cut weight in one day, which was harder for some, because, you have one guy cut 17 pounds in a day without proper dieting and everything. A little difficult. And you had a fight the day after. So the first fight was Mike Dolce versus Prince McLean. Now, first up, I want to say this, that there were some bad records on this cast. I hope that episode 2 is better, but there were some bad records. These two had a combined record of 8-9, although Mike Dolce is a better than a 4-4 fighter, I personally think. His losses are all to pretty decent fighters, but he was coming up weight class, so I had a little bit of fear on that matter. Nonetheless, finished off Prince McLean, or McLean, or whatever, pretty quickly with strikes. He has great power in his hands. He's a pretty good wrestler. Little prone to submissions. His striking isn't the greatest technically. It's a little bit like the Dan Henderson style almost of fighting, where it's very wild, and which ironically trains at Team Quest, so go figure. Next up was one of Forrest Griffin's good buddies, Cale Yarborough, 21-year-old, the youngest guy in the cast, against veteran John Clark. I think it was John Clark. John Clark looked good on a grappling sense. He looked definitely out of his element on the feet, though. He got some takedowns. He had a close to arm bar, but he gassed out. He was the one that cut 17 pounds. I think that might have had an effect on it. Cale Yarborough finishes him. He moves on. We also had two guys who had no fights, and once again, I kind of got to question sometimes the recruiting for the show. I know you could really show something in open tryout, but it should tell you something if a guy shows you something in open tryout and has a record of 4-5 or whatever, and you look at it and there's a bunch of nobodies that have beaten him, and that kind of pisses me off. Next fight was Steve Burns versus Amir Sodolev, I think, or Sadalo or something. I'll get it right eventually, but right now, no, we'll call him Amir for now. Good fight. Steve Burns, though, this is not the guy that we saw in the UFC fight Logan Clark, though. He was very, very low energy in comparison to the guy who was really, really moving when he fought Logan Clark and looked a lot better. I honestly thought that this was one of the guys that could actually win the show. I thought CB Dalloway was another one we saw tonight that was a possibility. But he lost to Amir Sodolev, who was a new guy. Now, Amir looked good. The striking was good, his ground game was good, his wrestling was at least somewhere near the level of Burns's. But I still think, looking at that fight, if Steve Burns fought like the Steve Burns that I've seen, and that other people have seen that saw his fight with Logan Clark in the UFC, which I still think both of them got shafted by not being able to come back. Logan Clark's, of course, in WEC now, has had a pretty decent run, but nonetheless, it was a little weird. Nonetheless, you had a good fight. Congratulations to Amir. Of the guys we saw win, of the full fights, I think he was the best. That being said, I think CB Dalloway was probably the best we saw tonight. He, of course, was in this little 4-pack fight package where he just destroyed the guy he was facing, which was something bad. I don't know. I should be looking at it right now, but I don't. Then another one of buddies of another buddy of good old Forrest Griffin came in. That was David Newborn. He got kind of smashed by a guy named Nick Klein. I don't know him. I don't know David Newborn. That's kind of the problem with a lot of these fights, is I don't get a feel for the guy because I don't know the guy he's fighting. Mind you, of the fights we saw the whole thing of, I do know Mike Dolce, I knew Steve Burns, who of course lost. I did not know Cale Yarborough or John Clark, although I keep thinking Cale Yarborough resonates in my head for some reason. And the other fight we get to see the whole thing of was Dave Roberts and Jeremy May, which I'll get to in a moment. Next up was Dante Rivera, who's a guy I know from IFL. He submitted John Wood relatively quickly with a Kimura that didn't look fully locked in. I'm not saying it wasn't. It just didn't look it from the angle that I saw it from. Then we had Paul Bradley, who qualified against Reggie Orr in a wrestler versus kickboxer match. Paul Bradley just took him down, held him down. Dana White was pissed. That being said, I think Dana maybe... Man, I mean, it is a legitimate strategy to take him down and hold him down. And guess what? You recruited him. And I looked at his record. It's kind of indicative that this is the kind of fighter he is. So, I don't know if you can really complain about that. After that, we got to the final fight we saw, which was Rampage's buddy, Dave Roberts, against the ever-amusing Jeremy May. Jeremy May winning by armbar. Dave Roberts kind of didn't show too well. He's a really big middleweight for the record, which might have hurt him. I'm trying to figure out how a guy who's like a brother to Rampage, and I assume had to have trained with Rampage at some point, has none of the typical strengths of Rampage's style. It's a little weird. Got submitted by Jeremy May. Next week we have the only fighter I can recall for sure is Gerald Harris, who is a comedian and a former IFL guy. I think he wins because they're making a fairly big deal about him, and they made a big deal about Amir Sadalov, and he won. So I would assume he wins. And there's apparently one of the worst knockouts that we have seen in the Ultimate Fighter. Then again, they've also claimed Nate Diaz and Rob Emerson was the greatest fight ever. So I don't know whether to believe that, but we'll see. If I had to make a prediction right now, I don't know the full cast, and that's kind of the thing. Is I know who fought today, and we'll see the rest of the cast next week. If I had to go with someone who of the 8 that qualified today, I would have to say CB Dollaway is my favorite because he's pretty well rounded. A couple of the other guys look actually pretty well rounded, like Jeremy May looked kind of well rounded. I don't know about his wrestling, but Dave Roberts is actually a pretty good wrestler, so I can't really complain about that. And we also saw some pretty well-roundedness from Amir Salah, but he's a new fighter, so I don't know. We also have Cale Yarborough, who's a brand new fighter, qualifying. And Mike Dolce, under the right circumstances, he's pretty deadly. He has heavy hands, like I said. He's a good wrestler out of Team Quest. A little prone to submissions, which kind of worries me against some of these guys. He's also not that big, because he used to fight 170 in the IFL. Dante Rivera is a kind of a one-dimensional guy. He doesn't have the greatest stand-up, but he does have good wrestling. He does have good submissions. Trains with Renzo Gracie, so he's also, I would say, somewhat of a threat. Although, but like I said, I mean, I'm looking at the fighter cast we had so far, and it's kind of weak. But it is what it is. We'll see what happens. Peace.